Hello again, Chris Weidenbach with Chicago National Commercial Services team out of Seattle. Here again with some helpful hints for real estate investors. I am joined today by Austin Bowlin with Real Estate Transition Solutions. Hello, Austin. How are you?
Chris, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me. Austin is, if some of you already don't know, it's just such a great resource for information, anything to do with 1031 exchanges or other opportunities for your properties. And I know that you're going to go into a little detail on what it is that your company does in your presentation. But from the start here, if we can just get give me a brief scenario of what it is that you guys specialize in and how you approach that.
Absolutely. So in effect, what our firm does is works with owners of investment real estate that are navigating what we consider to be the transition from the third to the fourth quarter of property ownership. That's a time in which an owner is often looking to be reducing the amount of time, energy, and effort that they're putting into actively managing their properties. They are often heavily concentrated in one particular property type or one particular geographic area. And so looking at ways in which they can begin to diversify, as well as address things such as enhancing income, liquidity, certainly estate planning considerations as well. And doing so all on a tax deferred basis. So I'm a CPA by background myself, and we're looking at ways in which we can help owners to transition their investment properties on a tax efficient basis into something that's going to be more in line with whatever their financial and lifestyle objectives are moving forward into that next chapter.
Great, great. And even before we started recording here, Austin and I were talking about opportunities for myself personally. And so he is just like I said, a wealth of knowledge and is connected with anyone and everyone. And while you guys are based in Seattle, you do have the ability to do business anywhere across the country. Is that correct?
We do, very much so. So we have an office here in the Seattle area, Mercer Island specifically, as well as Portland, Oregon. But we service clients all the way up and down the West Coast and then often on the other side of the country as well. One of the blessings in disguise about COVID is that it's really kind of been a catalyst for having owners, especially owners that are getting up there in their years, say north of 65, 70 years old, feeling more comfortable conversing and communicating online. So we can do all of our work via communication just such as this, Zoom calls, on the phone, sharing our underwriting information of properties, and make it really feel quite intimate even without physically meeting face to face.
Yeah, you hate to say that there's been positives of COVID, but it really has made it easier to connect with people that aren't physically located where you are. And then you guys are not limited to commercial properties, correct? You can do anything that is considered an investment property.
That's absolutely right. So we will work with property owners that are on the smaller end, selling anything from a single family rental or a condo that they have rental income on, vacation home, et cetera, all the way through larger commercial properties. The distinction between residential and commercial is really not material for the work in which we do. It's really more centered around whether that property is held for business or investment purposes, which generally means that it has some sort of income associated with it, but not always. Raw land, for instance, does not always have income, but what it needs to not be is held for personal use. So either a primary residence or a vacation home that is purely used for vacation purposes.
So something that, excuse me, something that fits into is being used as a VRBO or short-term vacation rental. Is that something that falls within your realm?
Mm-hmm. It certainly does. Yes, that would be classified as investment property.
Okay, good to know. Good to know. And today, I know that you are going to give us a presentation on Delaware Statutory Trusts, or DSTs, as that's another avenue of income that you guys can offer your clients. Can you give us a little intro to that, and then I'll actually share my screen to you here, or let you share your screen, so that way we can start your presentation?
Perfect, absolutely. So the Delaware Statutory Trust, which we're going to be covering today, it's a form of replacement property that is particularly, call it, flexible and applicable for folks who are looking to navigate that transition into what we consider to be the fourth quarter of property ownership. And it's one in which I know you recently, Chris, did a presentation with Kyle Williams at IPX 1031, in which he provided an overview of 1031 exchanges, the rules, mechanics, and timeline associated with 1031 exchanges. And what we're going to talk about today is a property type, a replacement property type that is not widely known, in part because there are some restrictions around how one can educate or market it as an option. We'll talk a little bit more about that on a subsequent slide. And also is a fairly new replacement property option, given that it was blessed by the IRS as qualifying for 1031 exchanges in 2004 through a revenue ruling that the IRS released, 2004-86. So we'll do an overview of Delaware Statutory Trusts. There's quite a bit of content to cover within the presentation, so this is going to be a fairly high-level overview, but we have additional resources that I'll make available at the end of the webinar today if folks want to dive deeper into it and learn more. And of course, we are always available for consultation or conversation to dig deeper in.
Great, let's get it started.
Excellent, perfect. So one thing that is worth noting is that the Delaware Statutory Trust is registered as a security. So it is important to note that, in order to do a 1031 exchange into a Delaware Statutory Trust, you do have to be what is considered an accredited investor. What that means is a net worth in excess of $1 million, not including the value of your primary residence. So keep that in mind as you are learning about DSTs as an available option, that you do have a requirement to be an accredited investor in order to do an exchange into a DST. But given the value of property, investment property specifically within the Puget Sound and coastal markets, typically that's not a threshold that is difficult for individuals to meet. A quick background on our firm. As I mentioned earlier, what we do is tax strategy and transition planning for investment property owners who are navigating that transition from, call it, the third to the fourth quarter of property ownership. Not necessarily a direct correlation between an owner's age, although there is some overlap there, but more a mindset of where you're starting to look at your portfolio and saying, maybe I'm overly concentrated, maybe I'm tired of the regulatory environment in the local market in which you own. Maybe it is that I'm looking to reduce my management time and effort, or estate planning is one of those issues that often sneaks up on folks because that no one likes to talk about death and mortality. But when a property owner is looking at either a single investment property owned or a portfolio of properties, it's very important to consider how do you transition that down to the next generation or your beneficiaries in order to preserve that deferred tax liability and then ultimately have what's called a step up in basis for your recipients, for the beneficiaries, meaning they inherit the property, and this could be a surviving spouse or children, nieces, nephews, not-for-profits, without any tax liability associated with that property. So we really take a deep experience in both tax code and then investment real estate as well, marrying my CPA license, my partner was a commercial real estate broker, and take that financial planning lens to a client of ours investment property and help them navigate that transition. The firm was actually started by my father, Roger Bowlin, just over 20 years ago. He was a commercial real estate broker and then went into more traditional wealth management before focusing on investment real estate with that financial planning lens. And I joined the firm 4 years ago after having worked at PricewaterhouseCoopers, PwC, both in their audit practice and then their mergers and acquisitions advisory group. So without further ado, what are Delaware Statutory Trusts? Well, the Delaware Statutory Trust is a form of ownership that allows for individuals to perform a tax-deferred 1031 exchange into fractional ownership of larger, higher quality institutional real estate. What we mean by institutional real estate is the likes of properties that you would typically see being acquired by either a real estate investment trust or a life insurance company, pension plan, university endowment, sophisticated investors that are often acquiring assets north of $30 million or more. That's a property type and a property size that in large part is going to be inaccessible for what we would consider the sub-institutional investor. Owners that own investment real estate in that, call it $250,000 to $20 million range. And while they could invest through, say, a real estate investment trust, that's not an option in which you can actually do a tax-deferred 1031 exchange into. So in 2004, the IRS released a revenue ruling that we'll dive into a little bit further that blessed this form of ownership for an individual to sell investment property and then utilize a 1031 exchange into a larger property, but owning a fractional interest of that property. And what's great about it is there's a number of attributes that really make it an attractive investment, but one of which, just preliminarily, is that the investment minimums in these properties are fairly low. Typically, the minimums are $100,000 of equity. So in turn, utilizing 1031 exchange rules, an individual could sell an investment property and then exchange into multiple different DSTs and really create a diversified portfolio of different property types located in different geographic areas with various investment theses associated with them. So that then they can have a portfolio that reflects their particular unique objectives. As I had mentioned on the second slide, you do have to be an accredited investor in order to do a 1031 exchange into a Delaware Statutory Trust. But if you meet that criteria, then it's definitely an option worth being educated and aware of.
While we're talking about this, Austin, do you have to 1031 exchange into a DST, or can you simply invest your own dollars into it?
By no means do you have to do a 1031 exchange into it. I would say the lion's share of the capital that is invested in Delaware Statutory Trusts do come via 1031 exchanges, but we work with a number of clients that see the benefit and merit of direct ownership of investment real estate. And what that largely consists of is, one, the tax benefits, the ability to depreciate the property and receive that depreciation as a write-off on your taxes. Two, the ability to continue to do 1031 exchanges down the road, forever deferring that tax liability until ultimately someone passes away, either the owner or the spouse of the owner, and the tax liability is then eliminated. So they recognize those benefits, but either do not have the skill set, the time, or the expertise to own their own investment real estate outright themselves, what we would consider fee simple ownership. And so they will cash invest into Delaware Statutory Trusts. So it's very much.
And so I apologize if we're getting ahead, but you can 1031 out of a DST into another DST.
Absolutely, into any type of investment real estate.
Gotcha.
So typically, the DST property is going to be held for a finite period of time. On average, that's around 6 years, although they will range between, say, 3 years at the very shortest to 10 years at the longest. And then upon the sale of that underlying real estate, each individual investor can then perform their own 1031 exchange into whatever property it is that they would like to go into for that next chapter. And that could be certainly another Delaware Statutory Trust or multiple Delaware Statutory Trusts, or alternatively, it could be back into a property that they own outright themselves, another fee simple property. So we'll see some investors use the Delaware Statutory Trust as a way to time the market, if you will, sit on the sidelines out of the local market, such as Seattle or Tacoma, for a period of 5-6 years, and then exchange back into the local market. Others will use it as a bridge for perhaps their children not being of an age in which they're old enough to be actively participating in the management of the property. Perhaps they're in high school or college, or are just getting their careers off the ground, or have a young family. And so they'll sell a property in the local market, exchange into DSTs with the intent of then coming back into the local market. But it's very much available as an option, and the plan of most, if not all, investors to continue to exchange so that tax liability is continuously deferred.
Great, thank you.
The revenue ruling that I mentioned is 2004-86, and without getting too deep into the weeds of the tax code here, why that's important is because it establishes the framework as to what the Delaware Statutory Trust can do with the property owned in the trust. And what you'll see is that it starts to put some parameters around what's allowable. And then as a result of that, you'll see how there's a certain property types that will be a natural fit to own within a individual DST. It's also worth noting that each DST will only ever own one property type within it. An individual investor could choose to exchange into, say, 3 different DSTs, one of which represents, say, multifamily properties, another self-storage, another single tenant triple net lease properties. But that's at the discretion of the investor. They're not going to be forced to commingle different property types together because a trust itself owns self-storage, commercial office, and medical office together. We'll go quickly through this framework and then jump into looking at some of the attributes and benefits of DST ownership. First and foremost, the DST is not allowed to ever make a capital call on the investors. Once you exchange, say, $400,000, $500,000 of proceeds into a particular trust, at that point, that is all that you will ever invest in it. And the sponsor, who has acquired the property and then managing the property on behalf of the investors, they will not go and ask for, say, another $25,000 for a capital improvement project or anything along those lines. The way in which the uncertainty of the property condition in the market is addressed is by including an allocation of reserves, as any prudent investor would do, to make sure that there's sufficient capital on hand for future maintenance expenditures. The trust cannot renegotiate loan terms, so you'll typically see what's called a master lease agreement in place for each of these properties. The trust cannot reinvest the proceeds from the sale of the trust assets, i.e. the property. And that goes back to, Chris, what you had mentioned. When the property is sold, that opens up the opportunity for the individual investors to do their own exchanges, as opposed to the trust deciding to reinvest the sales proceeds on behalf of the investors. The trust cannot make capital expenditures for structural capital improvements. And that structural word there is very key, because what the IRS is trying to do there is restrict the DST to more stable properties, not looking to be as opportunistic as you would see in a development initiative, but instead acquiring properties where you have a completely constructed property that's fully leased up and is going to be producing stable, predictable income for the investors. Cash reserves can only be invested in short-term debt. All cash other than reserves must be distributed to the beneficiaries on a current basis. And then lastly, the trust cannot enter into new leases or restructure the leases. And that's really not an issue that DSTs have to address, is entering into new leases, given that there is always a master lease in place with the DST sponsor, who then subleases to who the end user of that property is, whether it's a apartment renter, multifamily tenant, or a commercial tenant for something like a medical office property. The profile that the Delaware Statutory Trust is typically most suitable for is going to be that individual who, as we had mentioned earlier, is navigating that third to fourth quarter transition. This is generally speaking, but often that individual is north of 55 years old. They own property that has appreciated significantly throughout the period of time in which they owned it. And that in large part is meaning that they have a tax liability embedded in their property that warrants utilizing a 1031 exchange. Primary objectives that they're looking at for that next chapter of life are going to be preservation of capital, enhancement of their income, certainly simplicity as it relates to the management of the property, tax reporting for the property, et cetera, and then continuing to defer that inherent tax liability that is accumulating. What they're looking to avoid is often, frankly, active management. When you get to a certain age, you realize that the real finite resource is going to be your time. And wanting to enjoy their time, enjoy the net worth that they've worked hard to build while they're still physically able to do so, and certainly spending time with family, children, grandchildren, et cetera. They're not looking for speculative investments. They're far more focused on preservation of capital and stable, predictable income potential. They're looking to largely escape the regulatory environment that is pervasive in Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, San Francisco. And that's one in which I glance over often because it seems as a foregone conclusion that every major coastal market is dealing with an adverse regulatory environment. But that's probably one of the top three drivers as to why property owners are exchanging from the markets in which we have a physical presence into Delaware Statutory Trusts. And then the unresolved state issues, that is something that I often bring to the table and will mention to a property owner, of looking at a scenario where they might own 2 or 3, say, multifamily apartment buildings with 4 children, and asking them, what's the plan to allocate your estate among these children? Are you going to force your children into a co-ownership arrangement? We've cleaned up many of those situations on the back end, working with children after they've inherited properties. Siblings that got along with one another, love one another, but are not in an effective co-ownership relationship. So how do you be proactive there? And it's really on that first generation to be thinking strategically, how can I stage my estate so that it's going to allow for a seamless transition that's not going to be divisive for my family down the road. The benefits of the DSTs are numerous. And what you see within the DST is, one, the ability to outright eliminate active property management. The DST sponsor, that's a term that we'll use for the institutional investment real estate firm who has acquired the property, then provided it to us to underwrite it and determine whether we're going to recommend it to clients of ours. And then we'll stay on involved in that property, managing it throughout the period of ownership, and ultimately deciding on the date in which the property should be sold. They will take care of everything, every operating decision, all of the financial reporting, and ultimately that determination of when is going to be most advantageous for the investors to sell the property. Second benefit, it qualifies for tax deferral. That's why we're having the conversation following the 1031 exchange presentation that Kyle Williams gave. The potential to increase the cash flow depending on the property type in which a investment property owner is exchanging out of can be quite significant. It's very common for us to work with property owners that own multifamily, specifically in the Puget Sound, that are realizing somewhere between, say, 2.5 to 3.5% return on their equity in the property from an actual cash flow standpoint. Now, that's not a reflection of poor management by any means. Sometimes it is, admittedly. But more often than not, that's the result of the property having appreciated and having that appreciation outpace the increase in income, increase in gross rents. And then more specifically, within the last 2 years, we have seen expense growth outpace income growth. The rents more or less have stalled since late 2018 in the Puget Sound. And I don't think that anyone from Seattle Public Utilities to Seattle City Light got that message and said, oh, we're going to hold our billing at the same rate as well. And we're seeing the expenses continue to go up while rents are not going up. So the opportunity to increase the cash flow can be considerable when looking at DSTs that will be producing 5, 5.5, 6, 6.5% cash on cash return based off of the equity invested. As I had mentioned earlier, the low minimum cash investment allows for diversification among multiple property types and geographic areas. The higher quality properties provide some downside protection as well, given that institutional properties tend to not be as volatile from a value standpoint. There's debt matching that is facilitated through Delaware Statutory Trusts for those that are selling investment property that has a mortgage on it. There's a requirement to match that debt via 1031 exchange, and we can facilitate that through a Delaware Statutory Trust. Of course, limited liability for the beneficiaries. I don't think anyone would be investing in these properties if they were assuming liability for a 245 unit apartment building in Austin, Texas, but there's full liability protection, increased depreciation, and then again, the elimination of the estate tax if you are to move properties outside of Washington and stage it such that there will eventually, when the step up in basis is realized by beneficiaries, wipe away that deferred capital gains and depreciation recapture tax. The primary food groups among the DSTs that we see in terms of property types are going to be the 6 that are included here on this slide. Typically, a DST is going to own either a single property or a portfolio of properties, and that's going to depend on the size of the properties they're acquiring. So in multifamily, for instance, where you can easily acquire a 30, 50, or even $100 million single property, those DSTs will often own only one property within them. Whereas if you look at a portfolio of net lease retail properties, CVS's, Walgreens, Tractor Supplies, Kroger Groceries, all fully corporate guaranteed, all long-term triple, double, and absolute net leases. They're given the individual property size of, call it 1 to 10 million, it's not uncommon to see 15 to 20 of those properties packaged together in a single DST. Each of these property types has its own unique characteristics and market outlook associated with them, from a income focus or appreciation focus, from a stability standpoint, from a tax implications with various depreciation timelines. And the key point is that they can be blended together and mixed and matched to reflect an individual owner's objectives. So quickly, how are the DSTs structured? And I think this is important to give an overview of, given that it's fairly unique when comparing it to traditional ownership of real estate where an individual owns a property outright themselves. What happens is this firm who we've mentioned, or firms, there's a dozen of them that we work with, referred to as DST sponsors, they are underwriting properties on a continuous basis, placing some under contract, acquiring even fewer, and then ultimately when they do acquire it, utilizing their own capital, they then begin structuring the trust around it. There's multiple steps that go into that trust structuring, but what it's getting at is ultimately creating a available, full disclosure, on the shelf product that once everything has been prepared, it can then be provided to us and our broker dealer and a third party to all begin our underwriting and due diligence. Doing so of something that we know will be available, and there will be a certain amount of equity available for our clients to exchange into. Should we then approve of that particular property or portfolio of properties, we can then recommend our clients to exchange into it. And when an individual sells an investment property and performs a 1031 exchange into a DST, say they invest $500,000 into a multifamily property, that then displaces $500,000 that the sponsor used to actually acquire the property up front. Until over a period of time, which is shorter than most would think, most DSTs fund in somewhere between 4 to 6 weeks, they will have received all 30, 40, $50 million of equity coming in from various exchangers around the country. And then that particular offering will be closed and then managed for the on average 6 years and then eventually sold. Throughout that management period, the investors will be receiving their income from the property on a monthly basis, direct deposited to their checking or savings account, and then on an annual basis, all of the tax reporting information necessary for them to prepare their own taxes, and then eventually be told with, say, 3, 4, 5 months notice that the sponsor is planning on selling the property. So prepare and start thinking about what you would like to exchange into next. Another DST, back into the local market, pay tax, or any combination of. I'll do a quick illustrative example of a client that we worked with recently and the exchange that they did. This was a commercial office park that was in the South Puget Sound area, owned by 5 gentlemen who had actually built the property over multiple phases throughout the 80s. This was very much their primary source of income and both their occupation and hobby. I think they spent more time in the office together than they needed to from a work standpoint, but they were ranging from mid 80s through early 90s and looking at this property saying, our children don't want to co-own it together. We are in an S corp of all ownership structures. And how can we stage for the transition down to beneficiaries, preserve or ideally enhance our income, reduce our risk profile. And that's where, working hand in hand with the brokers they had been in communication with, we presented the Delaware Statutory Trust as an available option for them that largely fit every piece of their objectives criteria. Ultimately, what they ended up exchanging into was a diversified portfolio of 4 different DSTs. One of those DSTs had 4 multifamily properties within it, located throughout the Southeast. They had 2 portfolios of single tenant net lease properties that ended up representing 45 individual corporate guaranteed net lease properties within it. And then a single Class A multifamily property located in Florida, largely targeting stable, predictable income. And then with the multifamily properties, targeting growth states that were ideally non-income tax as well. So many folks, after hearing an overview of Delaware Statutory Trusts, say, this sounds like an intriguing concept. How would I learn more? What would be the next step? What we always encourage folks to do is, if this does sound like it may be a fit for you or something you are interested in learning more about, please feel free to reach out to us. As we discussed early on in this webinar, we're happy to do either a in person, on the phone, or video conferencing consultation. That's something that we offer complimentary. We host various DST focused webinars that you can find on our events page on our website, and then in-person presentations as well when eventually that is allowable to actually do. Lastly, we also have a guide to understanding and investing in Delaware Statutory Trusts on our website. So if you visit us at www.re-transition.com, you'll find that guide located. It should be on the right side of the web page. And that's a great resource to download, look through, write down any questions that might come up through your review, and then reach out to us and we can have a conversation to talk through those specific questions and within the context of your specific situation. There's further information if you would like to reach out to us, a phone number and an email address as well. But please do view us as a resource, and we're happy to help in any way that we can, whether that is within the context of Delaware Statutory Trusts or other tax deferral strategies and available 1031 replacement property options. So that's all I have, Chris. Are there any questions that you want to toss my way, or is there anything else?
I do have one question. And first off, thank you very much for that. It's such a robust presentation that you give, and one of many that you give. I know that I've attended some of your individual presentations. You do them monthly. You have so many different topics that you can touch on. The question that I had specifically though is, when would a property, is there a perfect time that a property owner would approach your company and say, hey, listen, I want to transition out of this property, or maybe even I don't want to transition out of this property now, but down the road I want to start to position myself in order to be able to do so. When is the proper timing in order to bring you guys into the fold?
That is a great question. And I really appreciate you asking that, because that's one in which I often don't speak to. And the answer to it is it's never too early. Even if you are contemplating a potential sale and transition 5 years, 10 years from now, I would very much encourage reaching out sooner rather than later, because there are some considerations that do take time to work through. And I'll give you an illustrative example of that. If a property is in a co-ownership arrangement, if it's owned by, say, 3 individuals that purchased the property together, they've owned it for 10, 15, 20 years, and now would like to go their separate ways, but all have a large tax liability that warrants doing a 1031 exchange, well, that property should not be sold as an LLC in order to facilitate those members doing separate exchanges. Ideally, what we will do is we will break apart the legal entity, restructure it such that it will be conducive for doing separate exchanges. Or perhaps 1 or 2 of those partners wants to actually pay tax and the other or 2 want to do a 1031 exchange. That restructuring does not take a significant amount of time from the actual work involved, but many tax preparers like to see the restructured entity be seasoned for a period of time, meaning the property is owned in that new form of ownership for a period of time in advance of a sale and a 1031 exchange. Those considerations should be put on the table and discussed early so that we can properly navigate and provide counsel for an individual property owner. The worst scenario is when someone waits all the way up until when their property has already sold and comes to us, or even comes to Kyle at IPX and says, we would now like to do a 1031 exchange. Well, unfortunately, that ship has sailed at that point, and you cannot retroactively go back and do a 1031 exchange. That exchange has to be opened before the actual close of the property. So from IPX's standpoint, or any other qualified intermediary, They would encourage you to reach out as soon as a property is placed under contract. Our standpoint, when we're taking that holistic view at an individual's financial objectives, lifestyle objectives, and within the context of what they own, what sort of liquidity they have, how much exposure and concentration they have, it is never too early to have that conversation. And frankly, that conversation is not something that we charge for. So it's going to give you further insight as to what options you have available and how to best navigate the coming years, even if a sale is well off in the future.
Very good. Well, Real Estate Transition Solutions is the name of the company. Austin Bowlin, thank you so much. This presentation has been great. His contact information is here. Obviously, I will put my contact information at the end here. We would love to be a resource for you for title and escrow services, both local to Seattle and nationally. I focus primarily on commercial, but can do residential as well. Thank you again, Austin.
Chris, thank you for having me. I appreciate you setting this up.